Your adventuring party has traversed a dark, grim dungeon, avoiding deadly traps and slaying foes to emerge on the other side, battered, but much richer. They carry a chest full of gold and jewels, and one plain golden ring that they are sure contains powerful magic. But what on earth does it do? Greetings, adventurers, this is World Building Boy, and today we're going to discuss identifying magic items in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We'll go over the basic rules of it, and then I will propose some variations and homebrew mechanics that you can use in your campaigns to spice things up for your adventurers. The Dungeon Master's Guide gives us 3 basic options, the first of which is the Identify spell. Identify is a first-level divination ritual usable by Bard, Wizard, Artificer, or the Knowledge or Forge Domain Cleric. When you cast the Identify spell, it's important to note that you have to have a pearl worth at least 100 gold pieces and an owl feather. But equally important to note is that the pearl is not consumed when you cast Identify, so that you don't have to keep on buying 100 golds worth of pearls to cast the Identify spell and figure out what your magic items do. When you cast this spell on a magic item, you learn its properties and how to use them, whether it requires attunement to use, and how many charges it has, if any. You learn whether any spells are affecting the item and what they are, and if the item was created by a spell, you learn which spell created it. However, not every adventuring party is going to have a Bard, Wizard, or Knowledge Cleric, and even if you do, they may not all have the Identify spell at their disposal, so the Dungeon Master's Guide gives us 2 other options for identifying magic items. One of them is pretty obvious. It is experimentation with the item itself. When experimentation is an option, you can be as generous or as strict with this as you like. For instance, an elf dons a beautiful but delicate headband, finding her thoughts to be clearer, so she attempts to recall a bit of history, finds it much easier to do so. Or a halfling puts on a feathered ring and jumps off a roof to see if she will float gracefully or plummet. However, this kind of experimentation may not work in all circumstances because some magic properties don't lend themselves to this kind of experimentation. For instance, a player may clasp a brooch of shielding to their cloak, but never actually find out what it does until they're hit with magic missile, finding themselves immune to its effects. The third option for magic item identification is the short rest identification. In the Dungeon Master's Guide, it says, alternatively, a character can focus on one magic item during a short rest while being in physical contact with the item. At the end of the rest, the character learns the item's properties as well as how to use them. Now, I find this rule to be pretty generous because it seems to almost make the Identify spell obsolete, and the Dungeon Master's Guide does address this, saying that you can, as a variant, just take that rule out of the game and require players to experiment with or cast Identify on magic items to figure out what they do. However, this does seem a little bit restrictive once you take that rule out. As an easy variant, I propose the ability to identify magic items with an Arcana check. So instead of the basic 5e rule that allows a player to identify magic items by spending an hour with the item in a short rest, I suggest the method requires an Arcana check. So instead of just resting with the item and finding out what it does, you have to make an Arcana check while resting with the item, and if you fail, you don't know what it does, and if you succeed to certain degrees, you may find out different things about the item. Some DMs may find fault with this method since, according to the player's handbook, the Arcana skill is only meant to recall lore about magic spells, items, traditions, and the planes of existence. However, the way I see it, if there are magic items in your world for purchase or simply to be found, player characters may well be aware of some types of them and maybe have come across them in the past. For example, there's probably more than one ring of jumping in your world that a character may have seen or heard of or even used themselves at one point. This means that a character should be able to identify some magic items based on their memory, that is, using an Arcana check. A very simplistic way to do this would be to say that a DC 10 Arcana check reveals that the item is in fact magical, but its properties are still unknown. But on a DC 15 or higher, the player actually identifies its uses, properties, and the number of charges should this apply. So basically, on a certain difficulty class set by you, the Dungeon Master, the player can figure out exactly what the magic item does and use it to its fullest potential. To add some nuance to this pretty simplistic rule, these difficulty classes can be made higher depending on the item's rarity, so that rare or very rare items are harder to identify than uncommon or common magic items, and so on and so forth. And of course, this is always up to you as a dungeon master to set those difficulty classes as you see fit. The DC 10 and DC 15 that I've laid out here are pretty simplistic and probably not the ideal way to do it. I do suggest adding a little bit of complication to it, depending on the item's rarity or its power level. All that said, you may want to do away with the resting Identify entirely and require an Identify spell. But if the party doesn't have a caster in their midst, you may suggest the players take it to an artificer or a wizard for hire who will identify the item for a price. My thought is that this may become tedious for the players and for you, so coming up with an alternative identification method is probably optimal. Another way you could do this is to make identify scrolls very easily accessible, purchasable at magic stores and maybe even general stores, so that players who find magic items may identify them almost immediately, but with a costly spell scroll. Of course, this is all dependent on the world that you've created. In your world, magic items may be very few and far between, only possessed by beings of great power. These items are extremely valuable and extremely powerful. In a case like that, it seems reasonable to require experimentation or an identify spell to figure out what a magic item does, and then in that case you might want to remove the resting identify rule entirely. But on the other hand, if your world is littered with magic items, especially the more common low-powered items such as bags of holding or boots of elvenkind, an alternate rule may state that players with intelligence of 16 or higher, or those that have proficiency in Arcana, can immediately identify magic items of common or uncommon rarity. Anything higher than that may require another means of identification. I think this is a very solid homebrew mechanic that can help to do away with some of the tedium of forcing your players to go find a wizard or find an artificer just to identify their bag of holding, which they were probably pretty sure that's what it was anyway, just based on the ubiquity of bags of holding. Of course, this is all dependent on the world that you're playing in, the world that you as a dungeon master have created. If your players are steeped in magic and finding items at every turn, it may help to make it easier to identify them. But if magic is much rarer and only possessed by the most powerful beings, it may make sense to make it more difficult to identify the powerful items that your players may come across. This is one of those subjects that is not too complicated, but you do see a lot of variety in the way it is run from one DM to another. So, I'm interested in hearing what you guys do for your campaigns, whether it's easy to identify things or whether you want your characters to really work for their magic items to figure out what they do. Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, do be sure to drop a like on it so that more people can see it. I will see you guys in the next one, and stay magical.